Welcome back to Trial Sphere, where we bring you the most compelling courtroom dramas and legal battles that reveal the true nature of justice. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because today's story is one you absolutely won't want to miss. Today, we're diving into a case that had everyone in the courtroom speechless. A case where arrogance met its match, where wealth couldn't buy the outcome, and where 30 seconds changed everything. This is the story of Marcus Blackwood, a billionaire real estate mogul who thought he was untouchable, until he made the catastrophic mistake of laughing at Sarah Chen, a single mother fighting for everything she had left. What happened in those 30 seconds? Stay tuned because this twist will leave you stunned. Before we begin, let me set the scene for you. This story takes place in the Superior Court of Manhattan, New York, on a humid Tuesday morning in June. The courtroom was packed, not with the usual court observers, but with journalists, cameras, and curious onlookers who had heard whispers about what was being called David versus Goliath, Real Estate Edition. On one side of the courtroom sat Marcus Blackwood, 52 years old, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. Marcus was the founder and CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, a real estate development company worth over $3 billion. He owned properties in 12 countries, had his face on the cover of Forbes magazine, and was known for his ruthless business tactics. In the world of Manhattan real estate, Marcus Blackwood was royalty, and he knew it. On the other side sat Sarah Chen, 34 years old, wearing her only professional outfit, a navy blue blazer she'd bought at a thrift store and had carefully pressed the night before. Sarah was a single mother of two, working 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet after her husband died in a car accident 2 years prior. She was a waitress at a diner in the mornings, a bookkeeper for a small grocery store in the afternoons, and cleaned offices at night. Her children, Emma, age 7, and Daniel, age 5, were being watched by her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was the closest thing to family Sarah had in the city. The case: wrongful eviction, property damage, and emotional distress. Sarah was suing Marcus Blackwood and Blackwood Enterprises for $2 million. Now, you might be wondering how a single mother ended up in a legal battle with a billionaire. The answer is both simple and devastating. Sarah Chen's story began in a small apartment building in Queens, a modest rent-controlled building that had housed working-class families for over 40 years. Sarah had lived there for 6 years with her late husband, David, and their 2 children. The rent was $200 a month, which was affordable even on their modest combined income. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. The neighbors looked out for each other. Kids played in the courtyard, and there was a genuine sense of community. Then Marcus Blackwood bought the building. It started with notices slipped under doors. "Exciting renovations coming soon," they proclaimed. "Your building is being upgraded to luxury standards." At first, the tenants were cautiously optimistic. Maybe things would improve. Maybe they'd finally get that broken elevator fixed, or the heating system that barely worked in winter would be replaced. But the renovations never came. Not for the tenants, anyway. Instead, Blackwood Enterprises began what housing advocates call constructive eviction. The building superintendent was fired and never replaced. Maintenance requests went unanswered. The heat was turned down to barely functional levels in winter. Hot water became sporadic. Then the notices changed. Building condemned for major structural repairs. All tenants must vacate within 60 days. Sarah, like her neighbors, was terrified. Where would she go? Rents in New York had skyrocketed. She couldn't afford market-rate rent anywhere in the city, and moving out of the city would mean leaving her jobs, pulling her kids out of school, and abandoning the only support system she had. She tried to talk to representatives from Blackwood Enterprises. She called dozens of times, each time being transferred, put on hold, or told someone would call her back. No one ever did. Then, with 30 days left on the eviction notice, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Her friend Maria, who worked as a paralegal, helped Sarah research the building's permits and inspection records. What they found was shocking. There was no condemnation order, no structural damage, no permits filed for major repairs. The city had never issued any order requiring the building to be vacated. It was all a lie. Blackwood Enterprises was trying to force out rent-controlled tenants so they could renovate the units and rent them at market rate, which would be 4 to 5 times higher. It was a scheme Marcus Blackwood had successfully pulled off with 7 other buildings over the past 3 years, displacing hundreds of families in the process. But Sarah wasn't like the others who had been too scared or too exhausted to fight back. She had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. With Maria's help, she found a young lawyer named James Patterson who worked for a legal aid organization. James saw the case for what it was, a clear violation of tenant rights, fraudulent eviction, and deliberate harassment. They filed a lawsuit, and Marcus Blackwood, for the first time in years, was being held accountable. The case gained media attention quickly. Local news picked it up first. Single mother fights billionaire landlord. Then it went national. Suddenly, Sarah Chen's face was on television screens across the country, representing thousands of families who had been displaced by greedy developers. Marcus Blackwood's lawyers tried to settle quietly. They offered Sarah $50,000 to go away. She refused. They offered $100,000. She refused again. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice. So they ended up in court on that humid Tuesday morning in June, with the world watching. The Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the case. Judge Morrison was 63 years old, a black woman who had risen through the ranks of the New York legal system through sheer brilliance and determination. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, her sharp legal mind, and her intolerance for grandstanding. She had seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by money, power, or reputation. As she entered the courtroom that morning, everyone stood. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the room with the measured gaze of someone who had presided over thousands of cases and could sense the temperature of a room instantly. "Be seated," she said, her voice clear and authoritative. "We're here today for the case of Sarah Chen versus Marcus Blackwood and Blackwood Enterprises. Counsel, are both parties ready to proceed?" Sarah's lawyer, James Patterson, stood. At 29, he looked young even for his age, with slightly messy brown hair and an earnest expression, but when he spoke, his voice was steady and confident. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff is ready." From the defendant's table, a man in a suit that probably cost what Sarah made in 6 months stood up. This was Richard Thornton, lead counsel for Blackwood Enterprises, from one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He had silver hair, a commanding presence, and the smug expression of someone who had never lost a case he cared about. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Judge Morrison nodded. "Mr. Patterson, you may present your opening statement." James walked to the center of the courtroom, and for a moment Sarah saw his hand tremble slightly. She felt her heart sink. How could this young legal aid lawyer stand up against Thornton's firm? But when James began to speak, his voice was strong. "Your Honor, this case is about fundamental human rights, the right to a home, the right to be treated with dignity, the right to not be lied to and manipulated by those with more power and more money. My client, Sarah Chen, is a hard-working single mother who played by all the rules. She paid her rent on time every single month for 6 years. She was a model tenant. She took care of her small apartment, raised her children there, and built a life there. Then the defendant, Marcus Blackwood, bought her building. And instead of being a responsible landlord, Mr. Blackwood and his company embarked on a systematic campaign of harassment designed for one purpose: to force out rent-controlled tenants so those apartments could be rented for 4 or 5 times more money. We will prove that Blackwood Enterprises sent fraudulent eviction notices claiming the building was condemned. It wasn't. We will prove that they deliberately denied basic services like heat and hot water to make living conditions unbearable. We will prove that this was all part of a calculated scheme to circumvent tenant protection laws, and we will prove that my client and her children suffered significant emotional distress, financial hardship, and violation of their fundamental rights as a direct result of the defendant's actions. This isn't just about one building or one family, Your Honor. It's about whether we live in a society where billionaires can break the law with impunity, or whether everyone, regardless of how much money they have, has to follow the same rules. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. James had captured exactly what this meant to her. Judge Morrison nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Mr. Thornton, your opening statement." Richard Thornton stood, and where James had walked to the center of the room with purpose, Thornton strolled with the casual confidence of someone who owned the space. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Blackwood, is a respected businessman who has contributed millions in taxes, created thousands of jobs, and revitalized neighborhoods throughout this city. He is being vilified in the media and dragged through this courtroom based on misunderstandings and misrepresentations. The facts are simple. Blackwood Enterprises purchased a building that was, in fact, in need of serious repairs. Yes, notices were sent to tenants informing them of necessary work. Yes, my client offered generous relocation assistance to help tenants during this transition. The plaintiff chose not to accept this assistance. What we have here is a tenant who, unfortunately, is dealing with difficult personal circumstances. And we sympathize with that, but who is now attempting to use the legal system to extract money from a successful businessman. We will demonstrate that Blackwood Enterprises acted within all legal bounds, that any issues with building services were isolated and unintentional, and that this lawsuit is without merit. My client is here today because he believes in the legal system and wants to clear his name from these baseless accusations." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest. Baseless, generous relocation assistance? They had offered her neighbors $2,000 to move out of apartments they'd lived in for decades. Not even enough for a security deposit on a new place. She glanced over at Marcus Blackwood for the first time. He was sitting back in his chair, looking utterly bored, scrolling through something on his phone under the table. He hadn't even looked at her once. The trial proceeded with James Patterson calling his first witnesses. He started with other tenants from the building, people who could corroborate Sarah's story. First was Miguel Ortiz, a 67-year-old man who had lived in the building for 23 years. "Mr. Ortiz," James asked, "can you describe what happened after Blackwood Enterprises purchased your building?" Mogul, speaking with a slight accent, said, "It was like they wanted us to suffer. The heat, it stopped working in January. My wife, she has arthritis. We were freezing. I called and called the number they gave us. Nobody answered, or they said someone would come. Nobody came. 3 months we lived with no heat in winter. Did you eventually move out?" "Yes, my wife, she got sick. Pneumonia. We couldn't stay. We moved in with my daughter in New Jersey. I had to leave my job. We lost our community, everything." Next was Patricia Williams, a single mother like Sarah, with 3 children. The hot water would go out for weeks at a time, she testified. "I have 3 kids. I couldn't bathe them properly. I couldn't wash clothes. I complained and complained. They told me it was being fixed, but it never was. Then I got a notice that my apartment had pest problems. Problems that didn't exist until they stopped taking out the trash from the building regularly. They used it as another excuse to try to force us out." One by one, James built his case. He presented documentation, the fake condemnation notice that was never filed with the city, records of maintenance calls that were never answered, emails from Blackwood Enterprises employees discussing their renovation strategy, which was clearly code for forced eviction. During all of this, Sarah watched Marcus Blackwood. He continued to look disinterested, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, checking his expensive watch, even yawning at one point. It was clear he didn't take any of this seriously. Then it was Sarah's turn to testify. James called her to the stand, and she walked forward on shaking legs. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat down in the witness chair. From this angle, she could see the entire courtroom. The journalists with their notebooks, the observers watching intently. Marcus Blackwood still looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Chen," James began gently, "can you tell the court about your living situation before Blackwood Enterprises purchased your building?" Sarah took a breath. "It was good. I mean, the building wasn't fancy, but it was home. The rent was affordable. My husband and I both worked, and we could manage it. Our kids went to the school 2 blocks away. I knew all my neighbors. We helped each other out, watched each other's kids, shared meals sometimes. It was a real community. And when did things change? About 8 months after my husband died. That's when Blackwood bought the building. At first, I thought maybe it would be okay. The notices said there would be renovations. I thought maybe they'd make things nicer. But then everything started falling apart. The heat, the hot water, the elevator that was always broken. Nobody fixed anything. And then we got the notice saying we had to leave because the building was condemned. How did that notice make you feel? Sarah's voice cracked. Terrified. I was barely keeping my head above water financially as it was. My husband's death had left us with medical bills and funeral expenses. I was working 3 jobs just to cover our basic needs and the rent. The notice said we had 60 days. I looked at apartments online. The cheapest thing I could find was $3,500 a month, almost 3 times what I was paying. There was no way I could afford that. I thought we were going to be homeless. I thought I was going to have to pull my kids out of school, move out of the city, maybe split them up to stay with different friends while I figured things out. Did you try to contact Blackwood Enterprises? Dozens of times. I called the number on the notice almost every day. I left messages. I sent emails. I went to their office building in person, but security wouldn't let me past the lobby. I felt invisible, like we didn't matter at all. What happened when you discovered the condemnation notice was fraudulent? My friend Maria helped me look into it. When we found out there was no real condemnation, no structural problems, I felt angry and relieved. Angry because they had lied to us, scared us on purpose. Relieved because maybe there was a way to fight back. That's when I found Mr. Patterson and we filed this lawsuit. James nodded. What has this experience cost you, beyond the financial? Sarah felt tears welling up, but she pushed through. Everything. The stress has been overwhelming. My daughter, Emma, started having nightmares about being thrown out on the street. My son Daniel asked me if we were going to be okay, and I didn't know how to answer him. I've had panic attacks. I can barely sleep. I feel like I failed my kids, failed to protect them and give them stability. And even now, even though we haven't been forced out yet because of the lawsuit, I don't know what will happen. Every day feels uncertain. Thank you, Miss Chen. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Morrison looked at the defense table. Mr. Thornton, your witness. Richard Thornton stood and Sarah braced herself. She knew this was coming, the part where they would try to discredit her, make her look like she was lying or exaggerating. Mrs. Chen, Thornton began, his tone polite but with an edge of condescension. You've painted quite an emotional picture here today. Let me ask you some factual questions. You say you were paying $200 per month in rent, is that correct? Yes, and you're aware that the market rate for apartments in that area is significantly higher? Yes, but mine was rent-controlled. That's legal. Indeed it is, but you can understand why a property owner might want to bring rents up to market rate, can't you? It's simple business. James stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? What a property owner might want is irrelevant if their methods of achieving it are illegal. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Mr. Thornton, get to your point. Of course, Your Honor. Ms. Chen, you mentioned that you've experienced financial difficulties since your husband's death. Is it possible that some of your distress stems from that situation rather than from my client's actions? Sarah felt her jaw clench. My husband's death was devastating. But I was managing. What made it impossible was being told I'd lose my home based on a lie. You used the word lie several times. Strong language. Isn't it possible there was simply a miscommunication? Buildings do require repairs. Perhaps the notice was sent prematurely, before all proper paperwork was filed. There was never any paperwork filed because there was never any condemnation. You didn't miscommunicate. You lied to scare us into leaving. Thornton's expression flickered with annoyance. Mrs. Chen, you're asking for $2 million in this lawsuit. That's a significant sum. Some might say an opportunistic sum. Isn't it true that you saw a wealthy man, saw an opportunity, and decided to get rich? Before James could object, Sarah responded, her voice shaking with emotion. I don't want to get rich. I want my home. I want my kids to feel safe. I want to not wake up every morning terrified about our future. If you want to know the truth, I wish I'd never heard of Marcus Blackwood. I wish he'd never bought our building. I wish none of this had ever happened. It was at this moment, this raw, honest, emotional moment, that it happened. From the defense table, a sound cut through the tense courtroom. Lotta. Marcus Blackwood was laughing, not a small chuckle, not a brief, quickly suppressed sound. A full, genuine laugh. He was leaning back in his chair, shoulders shaking with amusement, as if he'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. The entire courtroom froze. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Judge Morrison's eyes went sharp. Even Richard Thornton paled, turning to his client with an expression of horror. Something amusing, Mr. Blackwood? Judge Morrison's voice was ice-cold. Marcus Blackwood, still with a smirk on his face, waved his hand dismissively. I apologize, Your Honor. It's just listening to this whole performance. The tears, the sob story. Come on, she's living in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens for what, $200 a month? Do you know what those units are worth at market rate? She's been getting a bargain for years, and now she wants millions because we asked her to leave. It's absurd. It's Mr. Blackwood. Judge Morrison's voice cut through his words like a blade. You will remain silent or I will hold you in contempt of court. But Marcus, drunk on his own arrogance, didn't stop. He turned to look directly at Sarah, still sitting in the witness stand. Look, he said, his tone dripping with condescension, I'm sorry your husband died. That's unfortunate, but that's not my problem. I bought a building. I want to improve it. You're in the way. The market's the market. Maybe instead of wasting everyone's time with this lawsuit, you should focus on getting a better job, improving your skills, making yourself more valuable instead of looking for handouts. The courtroom erupted. Journalists started scribbling frantically. Observers gasped. James looked stunned. Richard Thornton actually put his head in his hands, and Judge Morrison stood up. Silence, she commanded, and the room immediately obeyed. She looked down at Marcus Blackwood with an expression that could melt steel. Mr. Blackwood, you have just shown this court more about your character than hours of testimony could reveal. Sit down and do not speak again unless directly addressed by myself or counsel. Mr. Thornton, control your client. Those 30 seconds. From the moment Marcus Blackwood laughed to the moment Judge Morrison put him in his place, changed everything. But Marcus didn't know it yet. He sat down, still smirking slightly, clearly believing that his money and power would protect him from any real consequences. He was wrong. Richard Thornton requested a brief recess, which Judge Morrison granted. As soon as they broke, Thornton grabbed Marcus by the arm and practically dragged him out of the courtroom into a private conference room. A court reporter who was in the hallway later described hearing raised voices. Specifically, Thornton's voice saying, "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've handed them the case on a silver platter." But when they returned to the courtroom 20 minutes later, Marcus still had that same arrogant expression. He genuinely didn't understand the gravity of his mistake. The trial continued. Thornton, now visibly flustered, tried to rebuild his case. He called witnesses, a structural engineer who testified about potential issues with the building. Though admitted under cross-examination that no formal inspection had been done, a property manager who claimed they had responded to maintenance requests, contradicted by documentation, and finally Marcus Blackwood himself. This was the moment Richard Thornton must have been dreading. Mr. Blackwood, Thornton began carefully, clearly trying to rehab his client's image. Can you tell the court about your background and your company's mission? Marcus straightened up, shifting into what was clearly a practiced speech. I built Blackwood Enterprises from the ground up. I started with one small property and grew it into a multi-billion-dollar company. We employ over 3,000 people. We've revitalized neighborhoods, created jobs, generated tax revenue for the city. Our mission is to improve communities through strategic real estate development. And when you purchased the building in question, what was your intention? To renovate it, to bring it up to modern standards, to make it a place where people would want to live. And the current tenants? We offered relocation assistance to everyone. We wanted to work with them. Some people accepted and moved on. Others, like Miss Chen, decided to fight instead of accepting the reality of the situation. Thornton nodded, though he looked like he was in pain. "Thank you. Your witness, Mr. Patterson." James Patterson stood up, and for the first time since the trial began, Sarah saw something in his expression that gave her hope. It was the look of someone who had just been handed exactly what he needed. "Mr. Blackwood," James began, walking toward the witness stand, "earlier today you laughed during Miss Chen's testimony. What was funny to you?" Thornton jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is attempting to..." "Overruled," Judge Morrison said flatly. "I'm quite interested in the answer myself." "Mr. Blackwood, answer the question." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean any disrespect. It was just, the situation is being blown out of proportion. A single mother describing her fear of homelessness and her children's nightmares is blown out of proportion." "Well, when you put it like that, how would you put it, Mr. Blackwood? In your own words, what did you find amusing?" Marcus's face flushed. "I just think people need to take responsibility for their own lives. I've worked hard for what I have." "Nobody handed it to me." "Nobody handed it to you," James repeated. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it true that you inherited $3 million and 5 properties from your father when you turned 25? Well, yes, but I turned that into more money. Yes, that's not in question. What is in question is your assertion that nobody handed you anything. You started with considerable advantages, didn't you?" "I suppose, but I still had to." "Answer yes or no, please. You started with millions of dollars in inherited wealth and property, correct?" Chen started with nothing. She worked her way through community college while raising 2 small children and caring for a husband with medical issues. She worked 3 jobs after his death to keep a roof over her children's heads. Would you say she's taken responsibility for her own life? I don't know her whole situation." "You don't? You just testified that you thought she should improve her skills and make herself more valuable instead of looking for handouts. Those were your words, weren't they?" Marcus was visibly uncomfortable now. "Yes, but I didn't mean..." "What did you mean, Mr. Blackwood? Explain to the court what you meant when you said that to a woman who works 3 jobs, has 2 young children, and is trying to keep her family from becoming homeless. I just meant that in today's economy, people need to be flexible, need to adapt. Did you ask her to be flexible when you sent her a fraudulent eviction notice?" "It wasn't fraudulent. We intended to do renovations, but the notice said the building was condemned by the city." "Was it condemned by the city, yes or no?" "No, but did you have any permits for major structural work at the time the notice was sent?" "Not at that exact moment, but we were planning. Yes or no, Mr. Blackwood?" "Did you have permits when the notice was sent?" "No. So you sent a notice to all tenants claiming they had to leave due to condemnation and major structural repairs, but there was no condemnation and no permits for repairs. What would you call that if not fraudulent?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "It's just business. We were streamlining the process. Streamlining the process of forcing out rent-controlled tenants so you could charge market rate, correct? We have a right to maximize our investment. By lying to tenants? We didn't lie. You just what, Mr. Blackwood? Help me understand. You sent a notice saying the building was condemned. It wasn't. You said major structural repairs required everyone to leave. They didn't. You cut off heat and hot water to make living conditions unbearable. How is any of that not lying?" Thornton stood again. "Objection! Counsel is badgering the witness." James didn't wait for the judge to rule. "I'll rephrase. Mr. Blackwood, do you believe that landlords should be allowed to lie to tenants to force them out of their homes?" "No, of course not. But that's not what. Did you personally approve the eviction notices sent to the tenants?" Marcus hesitated. This was dangerous territory. If he said yes, he was admitting direct involvement in fraud. If he said no, he was admitting he didn't know what his company was doing. I don't approve every single document the company produces. I have people for that. So you're saying you didn't know about the fraudulent notices? They weren't fraudulent, but you just said you didn't approve them, suggesting you didn't know about them. Which is it, Mr. Blackwood?" Did you know your company was sending false eviction notices, or were you unaware of what your company was doing? Marcus was trapped, and he knew it. His face turned red. I knew the general strategy, which was to transition the building to market-rate apartments by forcing out rent-controlled tenants through any means necessary, by legally terminating their leases and offering relocation assistance. How much relocation assistance did you offer, Miss Chen? I don't recall the specific amount. Let me refresh your memory. You offered her $2,000. Is that correct? That sounds right. $2,000 to move out of the city where she works, where her children go to school, where her entire support system exists. Does that seem like generous assistance to you? It's more than we were legally required to offer. Legally required? Mr. Blackwood, you weren't legally entitled to evict her at all, were you? She had a valid rent-controlled lease. She paid her rent on time every month. Under what legal grounds were you entitled to force her out? We were planning renovations, planning, not executing, not permitted for, planning, and those plans involved getting rid of tenants you saw as inconvenient because they didn't pay enough rent for your taste. Isn't that the truth? It's business! Marcus's voice rose, his composure finally cracking. Do you know how much money I lose on rent-controlled apartments? It's ridiculous. These laws are outdated. People like Miss Chen are living in apartments worth $4,000 or $5,000 a month and paying a fraction of that. It's not fair. Not fair to whom, Mr. Blackwood? To the billionaire who wants to make more money? Or to the single mother who just wants to keep a roof over her children's heads? To property owners, we have rights too. And do those rights include lying to tenants? Cutting off their heat in winter? Denying them hot water? Making their lives miserable until they have no choice but to leave? We didn't. Look, sometimes there are maintenance issues. Mr. Blackwood, yes or no, did you instruct your property managers to deny or delay maintenance requests to make living conditions difficult for rent-controlled tenants? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his lawyer. Thornton's expression was grim. I may have indicated that we shouldn't invest heavily in maintenance for a building we were planning to renovate. You may have indicated. Let me show you something. James walked to his table and picked up a document. This is an email from you to your property management team dated 8 months ago regarding the building in question. I'll read the relevant portion. Do not waste resources on maintenance for this property. We need these tenants out ASAP. Make it uncomfortable but keep it legal. They'll leave on their own if conditions deteriorate enough. Is that your email, Mr. Blackwood? The courtroom went silent. Marcus's face went from red to pale. Where did you get that? Discovery, Mr. Blackwood. Is this your email? Yes, but you're taking it out of context. What context make it uncomfortable and they'll leave on their own if conditions deteriorate acceptable treatment of tenants, Mr. Blackwood? Please, enlighten us. Marcus had no answer. James Patterson wasn't done. He had spent weeks preparing for this case, and he had saved the most damaging evidence for last. Mr. Blackwood, James continued, his voice steady but sharp, this isn't the first building where you've used these tactics, is it? Thornton stood immediately. Objection. Other properties are not relevant to this case, James countered. Your Honor, it goes to pattern of behavior and intent. The defendant has claimed that any issues with the building were isolated incidents and misunderstandings. I intend to prove that this is a systematic business practice. Judge Morrison considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but stay focused, Mr. Patterson. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Blackwood, how many buildings have you purchased in the past 5 years that had rent-controlled or rent-stabilized tenants? I don't have an exact number. Approximately. Maybe 12 or 15, and of those 12 to 15 buildings, how many still have the original rent-controlled tenants living in them? Marcus hesitated. I'm not sure. Probably none. 12 to 15 buildings, potentially hundreds of rent-controlled tenants, and none of them remain. That's quite a coincidence, isn't it? People move all the time. Did all of those buildings also have mysterious maintenance issues? Sudden condemnation notices? Offers of minimal relocation assistance? Some may have had similar situations. Mr. Blackwood, I have here documentation from 7 different buildings you've purchased. In each case, rent-controlled tenants report the same pattern. Maintenance requests ignored, heat and hot water issues, fraudulent eviction notices, and ultimately, everyone being forced out so the building could be renovated and rented at market rate. This is your business model, isn't it? It's good business to improve properties and maximize their value. At what cost, Mr. Blackwood? How many families have you displaced? How many children were pulled out of schools? How many elderly people were forced out of homes they'd lived in for decades? How many people like Sarah Chen have you victimized? Marcus's arrogance returned. These people aren't victims. They were getting a sweetheart deal on apartments they couldn't afford at market rate. I'm not a charity. I'm a businessman. So you admit that your purpose was to force out tenants who were paying legal rent-controlled rates? That's not. I'm saying that as a property owner, I have the right to manage my properties as I see fit. Within the law, Mr. Blackwood. Within the law. And you've broken the law repeatedly, haven't you? I've never been convicted of anything. Because most of your victims couldn't afford to fight back. They couldn't afford lawyers. They couldn't afford to take on a billionaire in court. They had no choice but to leave. Isn't that right? Marcus said nothing. But Sarah Chen fought back. And that made you angry, didn't it? I'm not angry. I'm just tired of this waste of time, angry enough to laugh at her while she testified about her children's nightmares, angry enough to mock her in open court. I wasn't mocking her. What were you doing then? What was so funny about a single mother's fear of homelessness that it made you laugh out loud? Marcus's jaw worked. He looked like he wanted to say something cutting, something cruel, but even he could see the trap. Anything he said would only make things worse. I have nothing further for this witness, James said, returning to his seat. Judge Morrison looked at Thornton. Redirect? Richard Thornton stood slowly. He looked at Marcus Blackwood, at the jury of public opinion in the form of the watching journalists, at Judge Morrison's stern expression. There was nothing he could do to fix this. His client had destroyed his own case. No redirect, Your Honor. Mr. Blackwood, you may step down. The trial continued for 2 more days, but everyone knew the outcome had been decided in those 30 seconds when Marcus Blackwood laughed. His arrogance, his contempt, his complete lack of empathy. It had all been on display for everyone to see. James presented more evidence. Testimony from city building inspectors who confirmed no condemnation order had ever been filed, financial records showing the minimal amount spent on maintenance after Blackwood purchased the building, and records from former tenants of other Blackwood properties detailing the same pattern of abuse. Thornton tried to salvage the case. He brought in character witnesses for Blackwood, other business people who praised his acumen, charity representatives who confirmed he'd made donations, but it all rang hollow after what everyone had witnessed. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Richard Thornton went first, and to his credit, he did his best. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Honor, this case has become emotionally charged. We've heard heartbreaking testimony about personal struggles and seen behavior that, while perhaps not well considered, doesn't change the fundamental facts. My client purchased a property. He wanted to improve it. There may have been miscommunications. There may have been maintenance issues, but there was no malicious intent. Miss Chen has suffered hardships, but those hardships stem primarily from her personal situation, not from my client's business decisions. We ask that you set aside emotion and look at the facts. Blackwood Enterprises acted within its rights as a property owner. We ask that you find in favor of the defendant. It was a professional argument, but it felt empty. How do you defend someone who had so thoroughly condemned himself? Then James Patterson stood for his closing argument. Your Honor, he began, Mr. Thornton just asked you to set aside emotion and look at the facts, so let's do exactly that. Fact, Marcus Blackwood purchased a building with rent-controlled tenants. Fact, he wanted those tenants gone so he could charge higher rents. Fact, instead of following the legal process for renovations, which would have required him to allow tenants to return at their original rent-controlled rates, he chose to lie. He sent fraudulent eviction notices, claiming the building was condemned when it wasn't. Fact, he deliberately withheld maintenance, cutting off heat in winter and hot water for weeks at a time to make living conditions unbearable. Fact, he has done this at least 7 times before, displacing hundreds of families. Fact, when confronted with the human cost of his actions, when my client testified about her children's fear and suffering, he laughed. These aren't emotions, Your Honor. These are facts, and they paint a clear picture of a man who believes the law doesn't apply to him, who believes that his wealth gives him the right to treat people as obstacles to be removed rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. My client isn't asking for millions because she wants to get rich. She's asking for accountability. She's asking for recognition that what was done to her was wrong. She's asking that Marcus Blackwood finally face consequences for his actions. This case is about more than one building or one family. It's about what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want a society where billionaires can break the law with impunity? Where they can lie to vulnerable people, make their lives miserable, and face no consequences? Or do we want a society where everyone, regardless of wealth, has to follow the same rules and treat others with basic human decency? Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. We ask that you find in favor of the plaintiff and send a clear message that in this courtroom and in this city, no one is above the law. In many trials, there's a long wait for a verdict, days or even weeks of deliberation. But this wasn't a jury trial. This was a bench trial, meaning Judge Morrison alone would decide the outcome. And she didn't need much time. After closing arguments, she called for a 1-hour recess. Sarah sat in the hallway with James, her hands shaking. "What do you think?" she asked him. James, who had been careful throughout the trial not to make promises, allowed himself a small smile. "I think that email was the smoking gun we needed, and I think Marcus Blackwood's performance on the stand did more for our case than I ever could have. That moment when he laughed." Sarah shook her head. "I couldn't believe it. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream at him." "Your dignity in that moment was powerful," James said. "You showed everyone the difference between you and him. You stayed composed. You stayed human. He showed his true colors." An hour later, they filed back into the courtroom. Judge Morrison took her seat and the room fell silent. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she began, her voice clear and firm. "I've heard testimony from both parties and numerous witnesses. I've examined documents, emails, and financial records, and I've observed the behavior and demeanor of all involved. This is one of the clearest cases of landlord harassment and fraudulent eviction I've encountered in my years on the bench. The evidence shows a systematic, deliberate campaign to force rent-controlled tenants from their homes through illegal means. The defendant sent eviction notices claiming city condemnation when no such condemnation existed. The defendant deliberately withheld basic services, heat, hot water, maintenance, to make living conditions unbearable. And the defendant has done this repeatedly across multiple properties, indicating this is not an isolated incident, but a calculated business strategy. Moreover, the defendant's behavior in this courtroom has been appalling. Mr. Blackwood, you laughed at the plaintiff's testimony about her children's suffering. You showed contempt for these proceedings, and for the very concept that you should be held accountable for your actions. You demonstrated a fundamental lack of empathy and basic human decency that frankly shocked me. This case represents exactly the kind of abuse of power that tenant protection laws were designed to prevent. Wealth does not place you above the law. Success in business does not give you the right to treat people as disposable obstacles. Therefore, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Sarah Chen, on all counts. For wrongful eviction and violation of tenant protection laws, I award compensatory damages in the amount of $300,000. For emotional distress, I award an additional $200,000. And because the evidence shows this was not an isolated incident, but a pattern of willful disregard for the law, I award punitive damages in the amount of $2.5 million. Furthermore, I am ordering Blackwood Enterprises to immediately restore all withheld services to the building in question, to withdraw all eviction notices, and to allow all displaced tenants who wish to return to do so at their original rent-controlled rates. Additionally, I am forwarding this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution for fraud. Mr. Blackwood, you came into this courtroom believing your wealth and power made you untouchable. You leave it having learned a very expensive lesson about justice. The courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed out to file their stories. Observers who had been watching the trial cheered. Sarah sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. $3 million, her home protected. Other tenants able to return. She looked over at Marcus Blackwood. For the first time since the trial began, he looked genuinely shaken. The smirk was gone, the boredom was gone. In its place was shock and the beginning of understanding. He had lost, badly. Richard Thornton was already talking to him in urgent whispers, no doubt discussing appeals. But everyone in the room knew this verdict would stand. The evidence was too clear. Blackwood's own behavior had been too damning. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. This court is adjourned. The story didn't end in the courtroom. In fact, in many ways, that's where it truly began. The verdict made national headlines. Billionaire ordered to pay single mother $3 million after mocking her in court. The video clips of Marcus Blackwood laughing and Judge Morrison's scathing rebuke went viral. Within 24 hours, they had been viewed millions of times. The public response was overwhelming. People who had never heard of Sarah Chen or Marcus Blackwood were sharing the story, praising Judge Morrison and expressing outrage at the treatment Sarah and other tenants had endured. But the real impact went deeper than social media buzz. Within a week, the District Attorney's Office announced they were opening a criminal investigation into Blackwood Enterprises' business practices. The Attorney General's office launched a broader investigation into tenant harassment by large real estate companies across the state. Tenants from the 7 other buildings James had mentioned in his cross-examination came forward with their own stories. A class action lawsuit was filed. Legal aid organizations that had been overwhelmed and underfunded suddenly found donors stepping forward, inspired by Sarah's case. The New York State Legislature fast-tracked a new bill, informally called Sarah's Law, that strengthened tenant protections, increased penalties for fraudulent eviction notices, and created a task force to investigate landlord harassment. For Marcus Blackwood, the consequences continued to mount. Several business partners distanced themselves from him. 2 major banks reviewed their lending relationships with Blackwood Enterprises. His company's stock value dropped. He was removed from the boards of 3 charitable organizations. The criminal investigation resulted in charges of fraud and conspiracy. While Blackwood's expensive legal team would fight those charges for months, the damage to his reputation was already done. He went from being featured on magazine covers as a business genius to being a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked corporate greed. Richard Thornton, the lawyer, quietly left his prestigious firm 3 months later. Those who knew him said he'd been deeply affected by the case, specifically by being forced to defend behavior he found indefensible. As for Sarah Chen, her life changed dramatically, but not in the ways you might expect. When the $3 million judgment was finalized, after legal fees and taxes, Sarah received approximately $2.1 million. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. Her first instinct was to buy a house, to secure a permanent home for her children. But James Patterson connected her with a financial advisor who helped her think long-term. She put most of the money in trusts for Emma and Daniel's education. She bought a modest 3-bedroom condo in Queens. Nothing fancy but theirs, with no landlord who could threaten to take it away. She quit 2 of her 3 jobs. She kept working at the diner, but now it was by choice, not desperation. She liked the people there. She liked the routine, and now she had time to be present for her kids, time to attend their school events, time to breathe. But something unexpected happened. Sarah's story had resonated with so many people that she started receiving messages. Thousands of them. People thanking her for standing up to Blackwood. People sharing their own stories of landlord harassment. People asking for advice, for help, for hope. Sarah realized she was in a unique position. She had lived the experience. She understood the fear, the desperation, the feeling of powerlessness. And now she had resources and a platform. 6 months after the trial, Sarah and James Patterson, along with several other lawyers and activists, founded the Tenant Rights Defense Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal representation to low-income tenants facing harassment and wrongful eviction. The fund was supported by donations that poured in from across the country. People who had been moved by Sarah's story wanted to help others like her. Within a year, the organization had helped over 200 families fight back against abusive landlords. Sarah became a spokesperson and advocate. She testified before the state legislature about tenant protection laws. She spoke at community meetings. She shared her story not for personal gain, but to inspire others to stand up for their rights. Her children, Emma and Daniel, thrived. Emma, who had suffered nightmares during the worst of the crisis, was now doing well in school. She told her mother that when she grew up, she wanted to be a lawyer like Mr. Patterson, so I can help people. Daniel, young as he was, seemed to sense that something important had happened. He told his kindergarten class that his mum was a superhero who fought a bad guy and won. In quieter moments, Sarah would think about the journey she'd been on. There were still hard days. She still missed her husband. She still worried about her kids and the future. But she no longer felt powerless. She had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, even when you're facing someone with infinitely more resources, can make a difference. And every time she walked into her condo, her home that no one could take from her, she felt grateful. Not just for the roof over her head, but for the reminder that justice, while sometimes slow and difficult, is possible. Sarah's case became a turning point in the conversation about tenant rights and affordable housing. It put a human face on statistics. People had heard about gentrification, about rising rents, about displacement, but they'd been abstract concepts. Sarah Chen, a real person with a real story, and 2 children who deserved stability, made it real. Urban planning departments at universities started teaching the case. Law schools used it as an example of effective advocacy and the importance of standing up for vulnerable clients. Community organizers cited it when rallying support for affordable housing initiatives. The ripple effects continued for years. Tenant protection laws were strengthened in 12 states. Funding for legal aid increased. More lawyers decided to specialize in tenant rights law, inspired by James Patterson's example. And Marcus Blackwood? He eventually settled the criminal charges with a plea deal that included massive fines and a consent decree that placed his business practices under oversight for 5 years. He remained wealthy. It's hard to completely take down a billionaire, but his reputation never recovered. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how arrogance and contempt for others can lead to downfall. More importantly, his ability to victimize vulnerable tenants was significantly curtailed. The oversight and the public scrutiny meant he couldn't operate the same way. The cost of his cruelty had finally caught up with him. So what can we learn from this story? What's the takeaway from those 30 seconds that changed everything? First, that actions have consequences. Marcus Blackwood had gotten away with his abusive business practices for years because his victims couldn't fight back. He had come to believe he was untouchable. But when he laughed at Sarah Chen, when he openly mocked a single mother's suffering in front of a judge, he revealed his true character. And that revelation cost him everything. Second, that dignity and courage matter. Sarah could have accepted the initial settlement offer. $50,000, even $100,000, would have changed her life. But she knew it wasn't just about her. By standing firm, by taking her case to court, she created change for thousands of others. Third, that the legal system, for all its flaws, can still deliver justice. Judge Patricia Morrison could have been swayed by Blackwood's wealth and power. She could have split the difference, issued a small penalty, and moved on. Instead, she recognized the case for what it was and delivered a verdict that sent a clear message. No one is above the law. Fourth, that change is possible. One person, even someone without resources or power, can make a difference. Sarah's case didn't solve all the problems with affordable housing or tenant rights, but it moved the needle. It inspired others. It created momentum for reform. And finally, that empathy and human decency are not weaknesses. They're strengths. Marcus Blackwood saw Sarah's struggles as something to be mocked. He saw her as an obstacle, not a person. That lack of empathy didn't make him strong or smart. It made him cruel, and ultimately it led to his downfall. Sarah's strength came from the opposite place, from her love for her children, her commitment to what was right, her refusal to be dehumanized. That's real strength. Today, if you visit that building in Queens where this story began, you'll find it looks much different than it did during the trial. The heat works. The hot water flows. The elevator is fixed. Several of the original tenants, including Miguel Ortiz and Patricia Williams, returned to their apartments at their rent-controlled rates, as Judge Morrison ordered. There's a small plaque in the lobby now, placed there by the Tenant Rights Defense Fund. It reads, "Home is not just a building, it's security, community, and dignity. Never stop fighting for it." Sarah Chen sometimes visits that building. She checks in on the tenants, makes sure everyone knows about their rights, connects people with resources if they need help. The children who play in the courtyard know her as Miss Sarah, the lady who saved our building. As for Marcus Blackwood, he rarely appears in public anymore. His empire has shrunk. His influence has waned, and somewhere, perhaps, he thinks about that day in court when he laughed at a single mother and set in motion his own undoing. 30 seconds. That's all it took to reveal someone's true character and change the course of 2 lives, and countless others. The question we should all ask ourselves is, in those moments that matter, what do our actions reveal about us? Do we use our power to lift others up or push them down? Do we treat people with dignity or with contempt? Do we stand up for what's right even when it's hard? Sarah Chen answered those questions with her courage. Marcus Blackwood answered them with his laughter. And justice, finally, answered them with a verdict. Thank you for watching Trial Sphere. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling courtroom dramas and stories of justice. Remember, the law exists to protect everyone, not just those with money and power. If you or someone you know is facing landlord harassment or wrongful eviction, organizations like the Tenant Rights Defense Fund and local legal aid societies are there to help. You don't have to face it alone. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought of this case. Have you ever stood up against someone more powerful? What gave you the courage to do it? Until next time, this is Trial Sphere, reminding you that in the halls of justice, truth and character matter more than wealth and power.